A man in worn boots walks into the most luxurious restaurant in Los Angeles. The waiter laughs, certain he's wandered in by mistake. But as whispered insults ripple through the dining room, something shifts because the stranger everyone's mocking isn't just another customer. He owns the place. And by the end of the night, no one will ever forget it. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The restaurant Aurelia stood like a beacon of elegance in downtown Los Angeles. Its tall glass doors reflected the golden lights of the street, and the steady hum of expensive cars filled the air outside. Inside, every surface gleamed. Polished marble floors reflected the crystal chandeliers above, each one shaped like cascading waterfalls of light. Soft violin music floated through the air, blending with the low murmur of conversation from guests dressed in silk, tailored suits, and glittering jewelry. Everything about Aurelia whispered exclusivity, a place meant not just for fine dining, but for being seen. At the center of this perfection was Richard Hale, the restaurant's most senior waiter. In his late 30s, Richard carried himself like the star of the show, not a man in service. His black vest fit perfectly, his bow tie straight as an arrow, his posture as rigid as the marble columns that lined the room. He moved with mechanical grace, each step rehearsed and measured. Other staff members admired his skill, but feared his temper. To the diners, he was charming, attentive, and polished. But beneath that surface lived something else, a pride so sharp it could cut through the warmth of the room. Richard's eyes constantly scanned the crowd, assessing and labeling every customer the moment they entered. He had a silent system for it, one honed over years of working in luxury. The ones wearing watches worth more than his car received his best smile. Those with worn shoes or hesitant voices got his polite but distant nod. He believed every glance, every gesture revealed someone's worth. To him, respect wasn't given freely, it had to be earned by presentation. Behind the bar, a young hostess named Lydia adjusted her name tag nervously. She was new, still learning to navigate the invisible social codes of Aurelia. Richard approached her with his usual brisk confidence, placing a tray of champagne glasses on the counter. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "Confidence first, sympathy second. These people aren't here for comfort, they're here for class." Lydia forced a small smile. "Yes, Richard." He straightened his cufflinks, glancing toward a group of executives seated near the window. "You see that man in the blue suit? He tips in hundreds. Always address him by name. The woman beside him? She's an art dealer. Compliment her earrings, they're worth more than your car." Lydia nodded, though the comment stung slightly. Richard didn't notice. He never did. His world was defined by surfaces, refined voices, expensive perfume, and the gleam of cutlery polished to perfection. Every interaction was a performance. Every table, a stage. He believed that the more beautiful the act, the greater the illusion of control. As the night grew busier, the restaurant's rhythm tightened. Waiters glided across the floor like dancers. The chef barked quiet orders from behind the double doors of the kitchen. And through it all, Richard reigned supreme, inspecting every detail with hawk-like precision. A smudge on a wineglass earned a glare. A slow server received a whispered reprimand. Nothing escaped him. But beneath that authority, something restless stirred. There was a subtle emptiness in the way Richard looked at people, as if he saw only reflections, never faces. He believed kindness was weakness, that humility belonged to those who couldn't afford pride. Tonight, that belief would be tested in a way he never expected, because the next man to walk through Aurelia's doors wouldn't fit the picture-perfect mold Richard adored. He would shatter it. Richard paused near the mirrored wall, fixing a faint crease in his vest. His reflection stared back, composed, confident, untouchable. To him, appearance was armor. He had built his reputation on it. No one had ever seen him lose control, not even for a second. But that control came at a price. Every night he measured people, not moments. He admired watches more than smiles, and saw value only where wealth glimmered. Across the dining room, a couple waved for assistance. Their reservation was late, and they were growing impatient. Richard swept across the floor, his voice calm but clipped. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," he said, recognizing them immediately. "Your table will be ready in just a moment. May I bring a glass of our house champagne while you wait?" The woman relaxed instantly. "That would be lovely." As he walked away, Lydia whispered, "You always seem to know who everyone is." Richard smirked. "It's my job to know. In this place, reputation walks in before the person does. You learn to recognize power by the way people carry it. Or by how they're dressed?" she asked, her voice cautious. He stopped, his expression sharpening. "Exactly. Clothes tell you everything. Confidence, class, intent. A well-dressed man is a man of discipline. A sloppy one, well, he doesn't respect himself or others. You'll understand that soon enough." Lydia nodded, though uneasily. Something about his certainty made her uncomfortable. She turned back toward the entrance where new guests were arriving, each greeted with polished courtesy and selective warmth. Some guests glowed under attention. Others were met with perfunctory smiles that faded as quickly as they appeared. As the evening reached its peak, the restaurant buzzed like a living organism. Wine poured smoothly, laughter echoed off the walls, and the scent of roasted garlic and seared truffle butter filled the air. To an outsider, Aurelia looked flawless. But to those behind the scenes, it was a kingdom run by hierarchy and unspoken rules. Rules Richard enforced without mercy. At the back of the kitchen, one of the junior waiters dropped a tray of glasses. The sharp crash made everyone freeze. Richard turned instantly, his tone sharp but controlled. "Careful, David. One more mistake like that and you'll be polishing cutlery all night. We're not running a diner here." David murmured an apology, his hands trembling as he picked up the shards. Richard shook his head. "This is Aurelia, not some corner cafe. Remember that." He returned to the dining room, satisfied that order had been restored. His world demanded perfection, and he intended to maintain it no matter how much fear it cost. In the corner, Lydia watched him work, her expression unreadable. She couldn't help but notice the contrast between the restaurant's golden glow and the cold precision of its staff. It was beautiful, yes, but also hollow. Everyone smiled, but few meant it. Every gesture was rehearsed, every word filtered. Richard thrived in that hollowness. It gave him power. Yet beneath the glimmering chandeliers, something about his composure began to feel brittle. He didn't know it yet, but the illusion he built would soon crumble. Because outside those polished doors, someone was crossing the street. Someone who didn't believe in appearances. Someone who had built his life on authenticity, not image. That man was Keanu Reeves. And when he stepped through the entrance of Aurelia in a matter of minutes, everything Richard believed about status, respect, and worth would begin to unravel. The night outside shimmered under the city's electric glow. Through the tall glass windows, streaks of passing headlights painted faint reflections across the marble floor. Inside, the dinner rush was reaching its height. Waiters carried trays like synchronized dancers. Guests lifted crystal glasses beneath golden light. It was the perfect picture of refinement, every detail sculpted to impress. Richard stood by the maitre d's podium, his gaze sweeping across the room like a commander surveying his domain. To him, Aurelia wasn't just a restaurant. It was a temple, and he was its gatekeeper. Each guest who entered was silently measured, welcomed if they belonged, tolerated if they didn't. That invisible judgment was what he believed kept the place pristine. He adjusted his tie and turned as the main door opened again. A cool draft slipped in from the street, along with the faint scent of rain. A man stepped through, tall, calm, and unassuming. His hair was a little disheveled, his boots were worn, his jacket looked comfortable but plain. No jewelry, no watch, no pretense. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Guests nearby turned to look, then turned away just as quickly. He could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. "He doesn't fit here." The hostess took a hesitant step forward to greet the newcomer, but Richard stopped her with a quiet gesture. His smile was polite, but his tone dripped with judgment. "I'll take it from here," he said softly. He straightened his vest, brushed an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, and began walking toward the man with deliberate precision. Every step echoed faintly against the marble, cutting through the soft music. In that moment, Richard had no idea that the simple-looking man standing before him was about to change everything he believed about class, respect, and what truly defines worth. The rain had started to fall lightly outside, scattering the streetlights into a soft, golden mist. When the glass doors of Aurelia opened again, a brief chill swept through the dining room. Heads turned instinctively, curious to see who had dared step inside without the polished perfection expected in this temple of luxury. Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the doorway. His clothes told a story few in that room could read. An old brown leather jacket, faded at the seams. A plain gray shirt, tucked loosely into dark jeans that had clearly seen better days. His boots were scuffed, the kind of wear that comes from living, not from fashion. He carried no designer watch, no shining accessory, only a calm, effortless presence that seemed to absorb the noise around him. The hostess at the stand looked up with a warm but hesitant smile. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Keanu returned her smile gently. "No, I don't. I was hoping for a quiet dinner if you've got a table." Before she could respond, Richard appeared beside her, his tone clipped and precise. "Excuse me, Lydia. I'll handle this." He stepped forward, his polite expression thin as glass. His eyes swept over Keanu from head to toe, cataloging every imperfection. The worn boots, the simple jacket, the absence of wealth. To Richard, this man didn't belong here. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the music. A few nearby diners lifted their heads. Forks paused mid-air. Keanu's calm didn't waver. He looked directly at Richard, his expression unreadable, yet kind. "I think I am," he said softly. For a moment, the tension thickened. Richard gave a tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "This is Aurelia, sir. We're fully booked most nights. Our guests usually make reservations weeks in advance." "That's fine," Keanu replied, his tone polite, almost serene. "I don't mind waiting if something opens up." Lydia shifted nervously behind the podium, glancing between the two men. She sensed the coldness in Richard's tone, the quiet disdain he was trying to hide behind professionalism. But Keanu didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he did, and chose not to react. There was something disarming about his calm. Richard leaned slightly closer. "We're not a casual dining place, sir." "Our dress code is," Keanu smiled faintly, interrupting him without raising his voice. "I'm aware. I came for the food, not the fashion show." A few soft gasps rippled across the room. Lydia's eyes widened, though she quickly looked down to hide her reaction. Richard's jaw tightened, his pride pricked. He took a small step back, recomposing himself, his tone dripping with controlled irritation. "Very well, sir. If you insist on dining here, I suppose I can find you something appropriate." He turned abruptly, signaling Keanu to follow. The pianist missed a note. Conversations that had once filled the air now dulled to whispers. And as Keanu walked past the glittering tables toward the dimmer back corner of the restaurant, not a single soul could guess that this quiet man owned everything they were sitting in. Richard walked ahead with quick, deliberate steps, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. He didn't bother looking back to see if Keanu was following. The room glowed under soft chandeliers, the kind of light that made diamonds shimmer and champagne sparkle. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, though the tension still lingered, like perfume that refused to fade. Lydia watched from the podium, her heart heavy. She could see the discomfort in the air, the subtle cruelty hidden beneath politeness. She had seen Richard behave this way before with people he thought were beneath the restaurant's prestige. But tonight felt different. The man he was dismissing didn't carry himself like someone used to being pushed aside. There was quiet confidence in his movements, something grounded and unshakable. Richard led Keanu through the main hall, past tables filled with elegantly dressed diners. As they passed, a few turned to stare. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Who let him in dressed like that?" Her husband shrugged, muttering, "Probably lost. He'll be gone soon." Richard's lips twitched at the overheard remark. He didn't disagree. They stopped near the farthest corner of the restaurant, beside a frosted glass partition that separated the dining room from the service corridor. The lighting here was dimmer, and the sound of clattering dishes from the kitchen could be faintly heard. It was the least desirable spot in the entire restaurant, usually reserved for walk-ins or those without reservations. Richard turned, gesturing toward the small table. "This will do for you," he said smoothly, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "It's private, away from the crowd. I imagine you'll appreciate the quiet." Keanu glanced around, then looked at him, smiling slightly. "I appreciate quiet," he said softly. "It helps you see people more clearly." For a moment, Richard hesitated. The calm in Keanu's voice unnerved him. He couldn't tell if it was sarcasm or sincerity. He cleared his throat and placed the menu on the table a bit too firmly. "I'll send someone to take your order shortly." As Richard turned to leave, Keanu spoke again, his tone polite. "Thank you, and take your time. I'm in no rush." The simplicity of that sentence caught Richard off guard. He gave a curt nod and walked away, his irritation barely contained. Across the room, a few diners who had witnessed the exchange whispered among themselves. One of them, an elderly man in a navy suit, shook his head. "That waiter's got no manners. The gentleman hasn't done a thing wrong." His wife agreed quietly. "He's so calm, though. I'd have left already." Lydia overheard them as she refilled glasses nearby. She smiled faintly, comforted that someone else saw what she did, the quiet dignity in the man's presence. Meanwhile, Keanu opened the menu slowly. He wasn't reading it. He was simply giving himself a moment to breathe, to absorb the energy of the room, the faint hum of music, the scent of roasted garlic and wine, the glances from other tables. He felt it all. But he didn't react. His expression remained peaceful, his composure unbroken. At that very moment, Richard glanced back at him from across the restaurant. The man was sitting calmly, his hands folded, his posture relaxed. To Richard, that serenity read as arrogance, a kind of defiance from someone who didn't belong. He muttered under his breath, "Let's see how long that calm lasts." And with that thought, the game had silently begun. Richard returned to the service counter near the bar, picking up an empty glass just to look busy. Beneath his calm exterior, something was simmering. The man in the corner, this nobody in old boots, had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. There was no visible defiance, no challenge. Yet, Keanu's quiet confidence had pierced through his polished arrogance like sunlight cutting through fog. He tried to shake it off. "Probably an actor," he muttered under his breath, unaware of the irony. "Or some lost dreamer trying to play important." At the hostess stand, Lydia glanced toward the corner where Keanu sat. His posture hadn't changed. He wasn't scrolling through a phone or fidgeting with silverware. He simply sat still, hands resting loosely on the table, eyes wandering across the golden-lit dining room as if observing a painting. There was something almost meditative about him. He looked at people the way others looked at art, with patience and curiosity. A waiter passing by whispered to Lydia, "Who is he?" She shrugged. He didn't say, just asked for a table. Richard's not exactly making him feel welcome. The waiter frowned. He's got that look of someone who's been through things, not the kind you want to underestimate. Across the room, Richard approached a table of regulars, an elegant couple known for spending thousands on fine wine. His smile returned, perfectly practiced. "I trust the evening is to your liking?" he asked warmly. The man nodded. "Always, Richard. The service here never disappoints." That praise lit a spark of pride in Richard's chest. This was his world, the world of people who recognized refinement. He turned slightly, glancing back toward Keanu's table, where the man now watched the pianist with quiet appreciation. The contrast stung him. To Richard, the stranger was a blemish, on an otherwise perfect evening. After taking the couple's order, Richard made his way toward the kitchen. The scent of roasted lamb and truffle cream wafted through the air. He leaned against the counter, exhaling sharply. "Who's that man in the corner?" the chef asked, noticing his scowl. "Just another wanderer who thinks this place is for everyone," Richard replied. "He'll leave soon enough. They always do." The chef raised an eyebrow. "He seemed polite enough," Richard smirked. "Polite doesn't pay the rent." But as he said it, a flicker of uncertainty passed through him. Something about those calm eyes, that measured voice, it lingered. He brushed it off quickly, telling himself he was imagining it. At that moment, Lydia walked by, carrying a tray of glasses. "He asked for water," she said softly. Richard chuckled. "Of course he did. Probably tap, too." Lydia hesitated. "Actually, he asked for still water bottled." That simple correction caught Richard off guard. He turned to her, surprised, then forced a laugh. "Good for him," he said, waving her off. "Let's see how he reacts when he sees the prices." As Lydia walked away, Richard straightened his vest and glanced once more toward the corner. Keanu was smiling faintly at something the pianist played, a slow, gentle melody drifting through the room. To everyone else, it was just another night at Aurelia. To Richard, it was still a test of pride. But for Keanu Reeves, the night had only just begun, and before it ended, this place of luxury would learn the true meaning of grace. Richard's stride was sharp and purposeful as he guided Keanu through the center of the dining room. Every step seemed designed to make a statement. He didn't slow down or glance back, weaving past tables where well-dressed guests dined beneath the golden shimmer of chandeliers. The air was filled with the clink of crystal glasses, the hum of conversation, and the faint echo of a piano melody that drifted through the space like smoke. Keanu followed calmly, his hands in his jacket pockets, his gaze steady. He noticed the way people looked at him, curious, uncertain, some even amused. It wasn't new to him. Judgment had a sound. It whispered through rooms like this one, subtle but sharp, and he had learned long ago how to walk through it without letting it touch him. Richard made no attempt to hide his disdain. "You'll find it quieter back here," he said flatly, leading Keanu past the heart of Aurelia, past the glittering center tables where the most esteemed guests sat, to a dimly lit corner near the kitchen doors. The sound of clattering dishes, muffled laughter from staff, and bursts of steam from the kitchen filled the air. It was the one corner no regular guest ever requested. He stopped abruptly and motioned toward the table. "This should do for you." He dropped the menu on the table with a dull thud. The gesture was small but deliberate, a silent insult wrapped in formality. Nearby diners paused mid-conversation, their curiosity drawn to the tone in his voice. Keanu looked around the corner table. It was clean but isolated, tucked so far away it felt forgotten. Then he met Richard's gaze, his expression calm, his tone unshaken. "Thank you," he said softly. "I've sat in worse places but never with worse manners." The words were quiet, but they landed with precision. Richard's smile faltered, and a few nearby patrons glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. The pianist missed a note. Even Lydia, standing near the hostess station, froze for a moment. Richard's posture stiffened. He recovered quickly, forcing a strained smile. "I assure you, sir, the quality of the food will make up for the view." Keanu's reply was gentle, almost kind. "Let's hope the food's better than the welcome." A faint ripple of laughter escaped from a table nearby. Richard's ears flushed with color. He straightened abruptly and gestured stiffly toward the chair. "If you'll excuse me, I'll have your server attend to you shortly." Keanu nodded. "Take your time." As Richard turned to leave, he caught the eyes of several guests watching the exchange. He gave them a curt nod, pretending composure. But beneath the surface, irritation burned. How dare this man, this unrefined, unannounced guest, embarrass him in front of Aurelia's clientele? He walked briskly toward the bar, forcing a smile for a group of regulars as he passed. "First-timers," he muttered under his breath. "They never last long." But something about the encounter lingered in his mind. The man hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't been defensive or rude. He had just told the truth, with calm that felt impossible to shake. And somewhere, deep down, Richard felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not yet. It was unease, the faint awareness that he might have misjudged someone he couldn't quite read. Richard stopped at the polished walnut bar, taking a deep breath before setting down his order pad. He glanced back toward the far corner, where Keanu now sat alone beneath the soft glow of a dim wall sconce. The stranger's calmness unsettled him. Most people, when placed at that table, either complained or left. But Keanu simply sat there, peaceful, as though the noise of clattering dishes and the smell of soap and garlic from the kitchen didn't bother him at all. The head bartender, a man named Oliver, noticed Richard's expression. "Rough start?" he asked quietly, wiping down a glass. Richard forced a smirk. "Just another walk-in who doesn't understand the concept of reservations. He's lucky I even gave him a seat." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "You mean the guy in the leather jacket? Seems harmless enough." Richard scoffed. "Harmless, sure. But look at him. He's completely out of place here. This is Aurelia, not some roadside diner." Oliver didn't respond. He'd worked alongside Richard long enough to know his moods. Instead, he poured water into a crystal glass and slid it across the counter. "Then, at least treat him like a guest," he said. Richard didn't answer. He took the glass and walked back toward Keanu's table, rehearsing a tone of professional indifference. But when he arrived, something about the sight stopped him for a moment. Keanu was sitting with his head slightly turned toward the piano, his eyes closed, listening to the melody. He wasn't fidgeting or restless. He looked at peace. Richard cleared his throat. "Your water, sir." Keanu opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "Thank you." Richard set the glass down a little too forcefully. "Have you had a chance to look at the menu?" "I have," Keanu said, glancing at it briefly. "Though I admit I'm not familiar with most of the names." Richard's lips twitched into a smirk. "They're French, sir. This is fine dining. Our guests usually know what they're ordering." Keanu met his gaze, unbothered. "Then maybe tonight's a chance to learn something new." That answer caught Richard off guard again. There was no defensiveness in his tone, only quiet sincerity. Richard didn't know how to respond. He tapped his notepad impatiently. "Very well, I'll give you a few more minutes." As he turned away, the older gentleman from the previous night's visit, a regular named Mr. Stanton, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He leaned closer to his wife. "That waiter's attitude is getting worse. He's talking down to the poor man." His wife sighed softly. "And the poor man doesn't even seem to notice. He's too kind to fight back." Lydia, clearing glasses nearby, overheard them. She wanted to step in, to say something to Richard. But fear kept her silent. He was her senior, her mentor in name, but her tormentor in practice. She'd seen him humiliate staff before, just like he was doing now to a customer. But this time, something in her gut told her it wouldn't end like the others. Richard walked past her toward the kitchen doors, muttering, "He'll leave before the entree. Mark my words." Inside the kitchen, the chef glanced up from plating a dish. "What's got you in such a mood tonight?" "Nothing," Richard said curtly, adjusting his bow tie. "Just a customer who doesn't belong here." The chef frowned. "Everyone who walks through those doors belongs here, Richard. You forget that. You forget the point of service." Richard rolled his eyes. "Save the philosophy for someone else." "I'm just keeping the standards." As he pushed through the doors back into the dining room, his words clung to him like a shadow. He didn't realize that every cruel assumption, every judgment he made that night, was slowly building toward a reckoning. And the man sitting quietly in that corner, the man he had just dismissed, would be the one to deliver it. Richard pushed the kitchen door open again, forcing a steady breath as he re-entered the dining room. He needed to shake the strange feeling that lingered, the quiet control of that man's voice, the way his words carried truth without venom. It was infuriating. He had spent years mastering the art of subtle dominance, of knowing when to make someone feel small while smiling. But tonight, that balance felt off. The stranger wasn't playing the part. At the far table, Keanu lifted the glass of water to his lips and took a slow sip. He glanced toward the window, watching the reflection of the chandeliers shimmer across the floor. Every few moments, he caught snippets of conversation, the murmured laughter of a young couple, the metallic rhythm of cutlery, the faint sigh of a waiter rushing past. He absorbed it all quietly, as if each sound told him something about the people around him. When Richard approached again, Keanu set the glass down and smiled politely. "This place is beautiful," he said. "You can feel the care in every detail." Richard blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. "That's the goal," he said awkwardly. "I can tell," Keanu replied. "Though sometimes the smallest details are the ones that matter most." The words hung between them for a moment, gentle, yet unmistakably pointed. Richard forced a tight smile. "Enjoy your meal, sir," Keanu nodded. "I intend to." As Richard turned away, several guests at nearby tables exchanged glances, sensing the tension in the air. Lydia stood behind the podium, her heart racing slightly. She didn't know why, but she had the feeling she was watching the beginning of something she'd never forget, an evening where arrogance would finally meet grace and lose. Richard returned to Keanu's table with a deliberate air of impatience, his polished shoes clicking loudly against the marble as if announcing his irritation. He had taken his time long enough to make a point, but Keanu hadn't complained. The man sat quietly, hands resting on the menu, posture relaxed. That calmness only fueled Richard's frustration. He had seen wealthy patrons panic at being made to wait, their tempers revealing how fragile their confidence really was. But this man, this stranger, didn't seem to care at all. Richard stopped at the table, forcing a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Have you decided, sir?" he asked, his tone brisk, as if speaking to someone who'd overstayed their welcome. Keanu looked up slowly. "I have." Richard pulled out his notepad with exaggerated precision. "Very well. What can I get for you?" Keanu studied the menu once more, then pointed to a dish listed near the top. "I'll try the house special, the truffle-crusted filet." Richard's pen paused midair. "The truffle-crusted filet," he repeated, his voice rising slightly.
"An excellent choice."
He leaned forward slightly, lowering his tone to make sure a few nearby tables could overhear. "Just to confirm, sir, that's $350. Would you like to reconsider?" A hush fell around them. The couple seated 2 tables over exchanged surprised glances. The woman frowned. The man muttered, "That's out of line." Keanu didn't flinch. "No, thank you," he said simply. "I'll trust the chef." The quiet confidence in his voice made Richard's chest tighten. He forced a short laugh, shaking his head as if amused. "Of course, sir. I just wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings later." "I appreciate your concern," Keanu said calmly, "but I think we'll be fine." For a brief moment, Richard was speechless. The man's composure was unshakable, his politeness unwavering. It wasn't arrogance, it was something more unnerving. Dignity. As Richard scribbled down the order, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "He won't last 5 minutes." A few patrons turned toward him, their expressions mixed with shock and discomfort. The pianist hesitated, missing a note in the middle of a melody. Lydia, standing near the entrance, stiffened. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She watched as Keanu's expression softened, not angry, not offended, just quietly disappointed. Richard stepped back, forcing his grin again. "Excellent. I'll put that in for you right away." Keanu nodded once. "Thank you." When Richard walked away, the whispers began to stir like wind through the room. Some diners looked at Keanu with pity, others with shame. One older woman shook her head, murmuring to her friend, "He's being humiliated for nothing." But Keanu didn't seem humiliated. He opened the menu again, calmly studying it as though nothing had happened. The flicker of golden light reflected off his glass of water, And, for a moment, he looked completely at peace, as if he were sitting alone in a quiet world that cruelty couldn't reach. And for the first time that night, Richard's laughter felt hollow. Richard walked briskly back toward the kitchen, the smirk still painted on his face, though inside he felt something strange, an irritation that wasn't satisfaction. He wanted the man to look embarrassed, to show some crack in that calm exterior, but there had been nothing. No awkward fidgeting, no nervous glance toward other guests. Just quiet composure that seemed to absorb every insult without letting it echo back. He placed the order on the counter and leaned toward Oliver, the bartender. "Guess what he ordered?" he said with a grin. "The truffle fillet." Oliver glanced up, unimpressed. "So, it's one of the best dishes." Richard rolled his eyes. "It's also one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. Look at him, no watch, no designer shoes. Probably drove here in something held together by tape." Oliver sighed. "You ever think maybe people don't have to look rich to afford dinner here?" Richard scoffed. "Not in this place. You can spot real money from a mile away. He's not it." From across the room, Lydia watched the exchange. She was clearing empty glasses, but her eyes kept drifting toward Keanu's table. He sat quietly, reading the menu as if nothing had happened. There was something gentle in the way he moved, as if he had all the time in the world. She carried a tray of drinks to another table and overheard two young women whispering. "Did you see that?" one said. The waiter practically mocked him. "Yeah," the other replied, lowering her voice, and he didn't even react. "That's class." Lydia smiled faintly, comforted by their words. Not everyone in the room was blind to what had happened. Meanwhile, Richard leaned against the service counter, staring toward the corner of the restaurant where Keanu sat. He couldn't explain why that man's stillness bothered him. It wasn't defiance, it was the complete absence of it. It made him feel exposed, as if his cruelty had been reflected back at him. He shook the thought away. "He'll regret that order," he muttered. "He's probably one of those dreamers trying to impress a date who never showed." As he spoke, a low laugh escaped his lips, but it felt forced. Even Oliver didn't bother to respond this time. Back at the table, Keanu took a sip of water and watched the pianist play. The melody was soft and unhurried, echoing faintly against the glass walls. He could feel the tension in the air, the sidelong glances, the whispers, but he didn't let it touch him. He had lived long enough to know that arrogance often came from insecurity, and kindness was not weakness but strength. When Richard finally returned with a forced smile, Keanu set the menu down. "Everything's fine, sir?" Richard asked, tone dripping with fake civility. "Everything's fine," Keanu said. "Just curious, do you always make assumptions about your guests, or am I a special case?" The words were spoken gently, but they landed like a quiet thunderclap. Several nearby tables fell silent again. Richard's eyes widened before he recovered his expression. "Of course not, sir," he said quickly, though his tone betrayed the lie. Keanu nodded slowly. "That's good to hear." As Richard turned to leave, he caught sight of a few patrons watching him with clear disapproval. A few whispered softly. One older gentleman muttered to his companion, "That waiter's about to learn a lesson he won't forget." Richard straightened his vest, forcing a smile. He didn't realize yet how right that man was, because by the end of the night, the man he'd mocked would not only own his dignity, he'd own the very ground Richard stood on. The dining room's golden calm seemed to ripple in invisible waves. Even though the pianist continued to play, the mood had shifted. A tension hung in the air, quiet but heavy, and most people could feel it. Every time Richard passed Keanu's corner, eyes followed him, waiting to see what he would do next. Keanu, however, remained unshaken. His posture was easy, his hands resting loosely on the edge of the table. He wasn't avoiding attention, he simply didn't feed it. To him, the room's discomfort wasn't something to fight against. It was something to understand. Richard came back with the wine list, still performing the part of the perfect server. "Perhaps you'd like to pair a glass of red with your meal?" he asked. His tone was polite but faintly mocking, each word edged with condescension. Keanu looked at the list and smiled slightly. "You choose," he said. "I trust your taste." The answer threw Richard off balance. He blinked, uncertain whether the man was mocking him back. He hesitated, then forced a laugh. "Of course, sir. I'll bring our most appropriate selection." As he walked away, one of the older guests, Mr. Stanton, called out softly. "Richard," he said, "a word of advice. Don't mistake kindness for weakness." Richard froze, then turned with a stiff smile. "Of course not, sir," he said, though his jaw tightened. Lydia watched the brief exchange and exhaled slowly. She could see the battle playing out in subtle gestures, the waiter clinging to his pride, the guest choosing grace instead of anger. When Richard reached the bar, he muttered, "Everyone's suddenly a philosopher tonight." Oliver looked up from polishing glasses. "Or maybe they just see what you don't." Richard didn't answer. He poured the wine. Himself, his reflection glimmering faintly in the mirror behind the bar. His own face stared back at him tense, proud, uncertain. For the first time that evening, he didn't look sure of himself. Across the room, Keanu lifted his water again and gave a polite nod to the pianist who had quietly changed the melody to something softer, more hopeful. The restaurant began to breathe again, unaware that the night's most powerful moment hadn't yet arrived. It was only beginning to build. The minutes stretched longer than they should have. 20 became 40, and 40 blurred into nearly an hour. The rhythm of Aurelia carried on, crystal glasses chiming, low laughter weaving through the air, the pianist filling every pause with gentle notes. But one table remained untouched. In the far corner, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, still waiting for his meal. Richard had made sure of it. Each time he passed the kitchen window, he prioritized the orders of his wealthiest guests, making a deliberate show of attending to their tables first. He poured their wine with a smile that was all performance, checking in frequently, offering recommendations, laughing at their jokes. Every gesture was exaggerated, designed to prove where his loyalty lay. But beneath that charm was something sharper, a growing resentment that he couldn't name. No matter how many tables he served, no matter how many times he distracted himself with empty conversation, he kept glancing toward the man in the corner. Keanu never complained. He didn't check his watch, didn't signal for help, didn't even shift impatiently. He just sat there, occasionally glancing around the room as though quietly studying a painting. The stillness made Richard uneasy. He had seen wealthy men throw tantrums over waiting 15 minutes for a drink, seen businessmen curse at staff for serving the wrong appetizer. But this man, this stranger, sat through silence with an ease that made the entire restaurant's arrogance feel small. At one point, Lydia walked past his table, her tray filled with desserts. Keanu gave her a kind smile. "It looks busy tonight," he said softly. She nodded quickly, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes, sir, it always is." "You're doing great," he added. "Take your time." The simple kindness in his tone made her chest tighten. It wasn't pity or flattery, it was genuine. She wanted to say thank you, but felt Richard's gaze from across the room, heavy and watchful. She lowered her head and hurried away. At the next table over, an older gentleman named Mr. Stanton noticed the exchange. He had been observing since the moment Keanu entered. In his 70s, Stanton had seen his share of arrogance in rooms like this, but there was something about this man's patience that struck him. It wasn't passive, it was deliberate, as though every minute of silence was a lesson being written in real time. When Keanu lifted his gaze, their eyes met. Stanton smiled faintly and raised his glass in a quiet gesture of respect. Keanu returned the smile with a nod, calm and sincere. No words passed between them, yet something meaningful did a recognition that dignity required no performance. Across the room, Richard caught sight of the exchange. His jaw tightened. He didn't like being watched, and he certainly didn't like the idea of someone sympathizing with the man he'd dismissed. To him, patience wasn't a virtue, it was weakness. And the fact that others were beginning to notice Keanu's composure felt like an accusation aimed at his own behavior. He turned abruptly toward the bar, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." Oliver looked up. "What is?" Richard shook his head, pretending to focus on a wine order. "Nothing, just a guest who doesn't know when to leave." But deep down, He could feel it, the tide in the room had started to shift. And for the first time all night, he wasn't the one in control.
Richard forced himself to focus on the glittering tables near the front, where the most affluent guests sat beneath the chandeliers.
He smiled at every gesture, answered every question before it was asked, and laughed when they laughed. But it was hollow. His mind kept drifting back to that corner table, the one with the man who refused to react. Each time he passed by the kitchen, the waiting plate for Keanu's order sat there untouched, the scent of truffle and seared meat filling the air. "You want me to send this out?" one of the junior servers asked hesitantly. "Not yet," Richard snapped. "I'll tell you when. I've got other tables to take care of." The young server hesitated. "It's been a while, sir." Richard turned, his tone sharp. "Are you questioning me?" The boy shook his head quickly. "No, sir." "Then focus on your section," Richard muttered before walking away, adjusting his vest like armor. By now, whispers had begun to circulate around the dining room. Regular patrons could sense the tension, even if they didn't know why. The pianist continued to play, but the music had softened, as if even he was aware that the atmosphere had shifted. At Keanu's table, time moved differently. He leaned back slightly, listening to the faint melody of a cello hidden somewhere behind the piano track. His expression remained thoughtful, unbothered by the long wait. A waiter passed by with a silver tray of champagne flutes, and Keanu smiled politely as he made way for him. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, patient, and gentle. At another table, Mrs. Stanton leaned toward her husband. "He's still waiting, isn't he, Mr.?" Stanton nodded, setting down his glass. "He hasn't said a word, not even once. That's the part that gets me." "Do you think he knows who that waiter is?" she asked. "I think he knows exactly what kind of man that waiter is," Stanton replied, "and he's letting him show it." Their voices were low, but others nearby caught fragments of their words. Soon, more glances turned toward the corner, some filled with sympathy, others with quiet admiration. Yet Keanu never looked back at them. He stayed focused on the music, on the small details of the restaurant, the flicker of candlelight against glass, the quiet movements of the staff. Lydia approached the bar, carrying an empty tray. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Richard, he's been waiting almost an hour. Maybe we should serve him now." Richard gave her a cold look. "Do I tell you how to do your job?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir." "Then don't tell me how to do mine." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "People like him don't complain because they're used to being ignored. You'll see he'll leave quietly, and we won't have to waste a good plate." Oliver frowned from behind the bar. "You might want to stop assuming so much, Richard." Richard straightened his tie and glared. "You think I'm wrong?" Oliver met his gaze calmly. "I think you're about to be." But Richard didn't listen. He turned away sharply, pretending confidence while his chest grew tight. Somewhere inside, that calm face at the corner of the room was still haunting him, not because of defiance, but because of how effortless it looked to rise above him. At that moment, Lydia turned toward the corner again. Keanu caught her glance and gave a small nod, a look that said he knew she cared, even if she couldn't speak. That silent exchange gave her courage. For the first time, she began to hope that maybe patience, real patience, wasn't weakness at all. Richard finally returned to the kitchen, the frustration on his face impossible to hide. He snatched the plated filet from under the warming lamp, glaring at the junior cook who had dared to ask earlier. "See? Still hot," he said sharply, though both knew it wasn't true. The edges of the steak had already lost their shimmer, the truffle crust slightly dulled. He carried it out anyway, determined to deliver the meal with false confidence. As he crossed the room, the chatter dimmed again. Everyone seemed to sense the moment. He reached the table, setting the plate down with a flourish that was meant to look professional, but landed as theatrical. "Your meal, sir," he said coolly. "Apologies for the wait, busy evening." Keanu looked up and smiled faintly. "No problem," he said. "I wasn't in a hurry." The simple answer made something inside Richard snap. He had expected irritation, perhaps a complaint he could justify or an outburst he could control. Instead, he received kindness. It disarmed him completely. "Well," he said, forcing a smirk, "patience is a rare quality these days." "Only when you expect something in return," Keanu replied softly. The nearby tables went silent. Even Lydia froze behind the podium, her eyes widening. There was no sharpness in Keanu's voice, just truth. And it hit harder than any insult could. Richard swallowed hard, realizing too late that his mockery had drawn attention from half the dining room. Several guests were now watching openly. The pianist had paused mid-song, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. Keanu picked up his fork, cutting into the steak. "This looks wonderful," he said, breaking the silence with sincerity. "Please thank the chef for me." Richard nodded stiffly, his throat dry. "Of course, sir." As he turned to walk away, his reflection caught in a glass wall, the gleam of the chandeliers above, the faint outline of his own scowl. For the first time that evening, he saw what everyone else was seeing. A man trying too hard to look powerful in the presence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. And that realization unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. A heavy stillness had settled over Aurelia. The air shimmered with that quiet tension that comes when everyone knows something is wrong but no one dares to speak. The guests had seen enough, the subtle rudeness, the long wait, the mocking tone. But they also knew that places like this thrived on pretense. For now the confrontation was hidden beneath crystal and candlelight, but the unease was spreading like smoke. At one of the central tables, a woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her husband. "He's being treated horribly," she whispered, her voice tight with indignation. "That poor man hasn't done a single thing wrong." Her husband frowned, lowering his glass. "That waiter's asking for trouble. You can see it in the way he moves. He's enjoying this." Across the room, another couple sat in uncomfortable silence. The woman bit her lip, eyes darting toward Keanu's table. "It's hard to watch," she murmured. "He's so calm. I'd have walked out by now." Her date nodded slowly. "Maybe he's used to it. Some people know how to stay still when everyone else is losing their manners." Meanwhile, behind the bar, Lydia was whispering to another server named Emma. The two of them were supposed to be polishing glasses, but their attention kept drifting toward the corner. "He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Lydia said softly. "There's something about him like I've seen him somewhere before." Emma squinted across the room. "Maybe. But Richard's been acting like he's serving a ghost." Before they could say more, Richard appeared suddenly behind them, his tone cutting. "What are you two whispering about?" Lydia flinched. "Just the guest, at table 15. Richard interrupted with a smirk. "Familiar with fast food, maybe." He let out a short, sharp laugh that bounced off the marble floor. The cruelty was deliberate, the kind of mocking humor that carried just loud enough to be overheard. Several nearby guests turned their heads, startled. Lydia's expression tightened, but she said nothing. "Focus on your jobs," Richard added coldly. "You're not being paid to gossip about strangers." He walked away without waiting for a response, his laughter echoing faintly behind him. Emma set down her cloth and shook her head. "What's wrong with him tonight?" Lydia didn't answer. She just glanced back at the corner where Keanu was still seated, eating quietly. His movements were slow, unhurried, almost graceful. There was something almost heartbreaking about this man, sitting in silence while being judged by people who didn't know the first thing about him. The older gentleman, Mr. Stanton, noticed the exchange at the bar. His expression darkened. He leaned toward his wife again. "He's mocking him in front of everyone now," he said softly. "This is going too far." His wife nodded, her voice trembling slightly. "It's cruel, Henry. Just cruel." As the couple exchanged uneasy glances, the faint hum of conversation returned to the room, but it wasn't the same. There was a new undercurrent, an invisible shift in power that even Richard could feel, though he didn't understand it yet. Keanu's patience was beginning to change the room. And for the first time, Richard's arrogance wasn't the loudest thing in Aurelia. The tension in Aurelia thickened until it became almost tangible. It wasn't a scene anyone wanted to witness, but human curiosity has its gravity. Whispers began to thread through the dining room, quiet enough to seem private, but loud enough for others to catch fragments of them. At one of the larger tables, a group of young professionals exchanged awkward glances. "It's ridiculous," one of them muttered. "He's been nothing but polite, and that waiter treats him like dirt." "Don't say it too loud," another warned under his breath. "The staff here think they're untouchable." Across the room, a middle-aged woman watched Keanu carefully. "There's something about him," she said softly to her companion. "I can't place it, but he doesn't seem ordinary. Look at how he holds himself. He's calm, but you can tell he's someone important." Her companion shrugged. "Important or not, that waiter's going to regret his mouth." Behind the bar, Lydia pretended to polish a row of champagne flutes while keeping an eye on Richard. She could see the faint restlessness building in him, the way his shoulders tightened, the nervous twitch in his jaw. His confidence was beginning to crack, but instead of reflection, arrogance filled the cracks. He felt the stares, heard the murmurs, and mistook them for judgment against Keanu rather than himself. Richard leaned toward Oliver, forcing a laugh. "They're acting like I insulted royalty. The guy looks like he came straight from a bus stop." Oliver didn't smile. "Maybe that's your problem. You see the jacket, not the person." Richard gave a short, bitter laugh. "People pay to eat here for a reason, Oliver. It's not charity. This is Aurelia. There's a standard for food, not cruelty," Oliver replied calmly. "You're crossing a line and everyone can see it but you." Richard rolled his eyes and turned away. Save the sermon. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to eat quietly, occasionally looking up as if noticing the soft exchanges but never reacting to them. His restraint carried weight. It wasn't silence born of fear. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than anger ever could. Every bite, every glance, every patient breath seemed to magnify the contrast between his grace and Richard's hostility. At another table, "Mrs." Stanton whispered, "He's making the whole place uncomfortable, Henry." Her husband nodded grimly. "Because he's showing us something about ourselves, how easy it is to judge." That thought lingered, heavy and true. Even those who hadn't spoken began to feel it, the discomfort of realizing they'd said nothing while cruelty unfolded in front of them. As Richard walked past again, he forced another smirk. "Still enjoying everything, sir?" he asked, his tone dipped in irony. Keanu looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. "Very much," he said, "though I do wonder if you treat every customer this way, or if I'm just lucky." The question wasn't a challenge, it was truth wrapped in courtesy. Richard froze for half a second, thrown off balance again. "I treat everyone appropriately," he said stiffly, before walking off too quickly. From across the room, Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. "He's losing control." Oliver nodded, "and he doesn't even know it yet." The pianist shifted into a slower tune, the melody curling through the air like smoke. It softened the room's edges, but the tension remained, clinging to every polished surface. No one was laughing anymore. Conversations turned into whispers, cautious and fragmented. Everyone could feel the imbalance, the arrogance of one man against the quiet dignity of another. At a nearby table, two young women glanced toward the corner. One leaned closer and whispered, "He's not just calm, he's different. Like he's seen worse things and decided not to let small people ruin his peace." Her friend nodded slowly. "I think he knows exactly what's happening, and he's letting the waiter reveal who he really is." Their words floated through the hum of the dining room. Others heard them and began murmuring in agreement. The energy of the room was changing, slowly turning in Keanu's favor without him saying a word. At the bar, Richard noticed the glances. He could feel the atmosphere shifting against him, though he didn't understand why. He leaned over to Lydia and said bitterly, "They're all staring because he doesn't belong here. They see it too." Lydia's voice was quiet but firm. "No, Richard, they're staring because of the way you're treating him." He turned to her, eyes cold. "You're out of line." "I don't think I am," she replied, barely above a whisper. "You're humiliating him for no reason?" Richard glared, then laughed dismissively, loud enough for a few patrons to hear. Relax, Lydia. It's just dinner. He'll survive. The laughter was hollow, echoing uncomfortably against the marble walls. Several guests looked over, frowning. Even the pianist hesitated mid-note before continuing his song. Across, in the room, Keanu raised his eyes briefly from his plate. His gaze moved toward Lydia for a moment, a silent acknowledgement, a small, grateful smile. She returned it with a nod so faint it was almost invisible. That single exchange spoke volumes. It reminded everyone watching that quiet kindness could exist even in the smallest gestures. And for the first time that evening, the arrogance of one waiter felt painfully small compared to the grace of the man he tried so hard to belittle. The kitchen doors swung open as Richard emerged carrying a small porcelain plate balanced perfectly on his hand. The appetizer, an intricate blend of seared scallops and black truffle puree, was one of Aurelia's most elegant dishes, crafted to be savored, not served with hostility. But the expression on Richard's face stripped away its refinement. His movements were sharp, mechanical, charged with irritation he no longer tried to hide. He crossed the dining room briskly, ignoring the faint hush that followed him. Every eye seemed to track his path, though no one said a word. When he reached Keanu's table, he set the plate down with a force that made the silverware rattle faintly against the china. "Your appetizer," he said curtly. "Hope you enjoy it, or at least recognize it." The words carried the sting of mockery. The few diners close enough to hear stiffened in discomfort. Lydia froze near the bar, her heart sinking. The cruelty wasn't subtle anymore. It was deliberate. Keanu looked down at the dish, admiring it quietly for a moment, before raising his eyes. "It looks wonderful," he said, softly. "Thank you." His voice was calm, measured, completely devoid of resentment. The gentleness of it made the insult fall flat, dissolving into awkward silence. Richard's smirk faltered. He expected irritation, perhaps even anger, but the serenity on Keanu's face was unbreakable. It made him feel small, though he couldn't explain why. As Keanu picked up his fork, the pianist faltered slightly, missing a note. It was barely noticeable, but enough to make a few heads turn toward the stage, then toward the corner table where tension seemed to hum like electricity. Keanu cut into the scallop with quiet precision, took a bite, and closed his eyes briefly, as if to appreciate the flavor. When he opened them, he smiled faintly. "Perfect balance," he said, loud enough for Richard to hear. "You should tell the chef he's talented." Richard blinked. He hadn't expected a compliment. "Of course, sir," he replied quickly, his tone defensive, almost confused. Keanu's smile didn't fade. "No rush," he said. "He deserves to hear it when you have the time. The restraint, the patience, the effortless grace." It was starting to shift the room's atmosphere. Around the dining hall, people exchanged quiet looks. Conversations faded to murmurs. The arrogance that had filled the space earlier was slowly being replaced by curiosity, even respect. Richard turned away, his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. He didn't understand why this man's composure unnerved him so deeply. It was like trying to provoke a mountain. It didn't move, it just stood there, unbothered by storms. He walked back toward the bar, muttering under his breath. "He's doing this on purpose." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Doing what, exactly?" "Playing innocent," Richard said. "He knows he's getting attention. He's trying to make me look bad." Oliver leaned forward slightly. "You don't need help with that tonight." Richard glared at him, but said nothing. He could feel the walls closing in the silent disapproval of guests, the uneasy energy in the air. He wanted to reclaim control, but the man in the corner had already taken it without saying a single harsh word. And deep down, Richard knew it. Richard lingered near the bar, pretending to polish glasses that didn't need polishing. He couldn't stop glancing at the far corner, where Keanu continued to eat quietly. Every few moments, the stranger lifted his fork, taking slow, deliberate bites as if savoring each one. It wasn't the reaction Richard wanted. He had hoped for discomfort, maybe even visible embarrassment. Instead, he saw calm satisfaction, the kind that came from someone entirely in control of themselves. Lydia passed by carrying a tray of empty plates. She hesitated, her voice soft. "You didn't have to say that. You know, about recognizing the food." Richard looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" "You mocked him," she said, lowering her voice. Everyone heard it. Richard's jaw tightened. "He doesn't care, Lydia. You saw him, he's probably enjoying the attention." Lydia shook her head. "No, he's just not like the people you usually deal with." Richard let out a cold laugh. "He's not like them, that's for sure." At that same moment, a faint hush spread across the dining room again. The pianist, seemingly affected by the tension, slowed his rhythm to a haunting, deliberate melody. The sound carried like a sigh through the restaurant. Several guests turned toward Keanu's table again, drawn by an energy they couldn't explain. "That man's grace," he whispered to his wife. "It's changing the room." She nodded. "It feels different. Like we're all being reminded of something we've forgotten." Keanu finished the last bite of his appetizer, then carefully placed his fork down. He took a sip of water, his movements patient and unhurried. Then he raised his hand slightly, signaling for Richard. Richard approached, trying to reassert authority in his tone. "Yes, sir?" "The appetizer," Keanu said, meeting his gaze. "It was excellent. Please thank the chef for his work. The texture was perfect." Richard blinked, momentarily stunned. "You liked it?" "I did," Keanu replied. "You know, when someone cooks with care, you can feel it." The waiter hesitated, caught between irritation and confusion. "I'll let him know," he said finally, his voice faltering. As Richard walked away, he could feel eyes on him again. Not admiration, judgment. He glanced around the room, and for the first time that night, he realized he was no longer the one being observed with respect. It was the man he had tried so hard to diminish. At the bar, Oliver spoke quietly, without looking up. "He's not what you think, Richard. I'd start being careful." Richard frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Oliver set down a glass and met his eyes. "It means you're about to learn who you're dealing with." But Richard brushed him off. He didn't want to believe it. Not yet. The idea that the man in the corner, quiet, humble, unassuming, could be anyone of significance seemed impossible. Still, when he turned back toward the table, Keanu was watching him, calm and composed, almost as if he knew exactly what Richard was thinking. The look wasn't cold or proud. It was something worse for Richard's ego understanding. It was the gaze of someone who didn't need to win to prove he'd already won. Richard lingered by the kitchen doors longer than usual, pretending to check the order list, but in truth, he was avoiding going back to the dining room. He could feel the shift in the air, the guests' hushed voices, the disapproving glances, and every one of them pointed back to him. His confidence was cracking, even if his pride refused to admit it. When the head chef, Marcel, emerged from the back, he spotted Richard's rigid posture. "The man at table 15, Marcel said. He complimented the appetizer?" Richard frowned, surprised. "He did. Why?" Marcel wiped his hands on his apron, his voice firm but calm. "Then you should treat him with respect." He noticed the details. "Most people don't." "It means he's paying attention," Richard scoffed, crossing his arms. "Or pretending to. I've seen people like him acting sophisticated to hide what they're not." Marcel gave him a long look. "And I've seen people like you mistaking arrogance for standards." The word stung, and Richard turned sharply away. "You worry about the kitchen, Marcel. I'll worry about the service." As he stepped back into the dining room, the piano music softened again. It was strange. Almost every note seemed to follow the rhythm of Keanu's calm. The man wasn't trying to command attention, yet he had it anyway. Every gesture he made, every quiet smile or glance, seemed to draw the entire restaurant into orbit around him. Keanu was now sipping his wine, the glass held lightly between his fingers. He didn't drink it for show, he drank it thoughtfully, as though savoring both the flavor and the stillness. When he noticed Richard approaching, he set the glass down gently. Was there a problem with the service? Richard asked quickly, trying to reclaim the upper hand. Keanu looked at him, his eyes steady. "No problem.
he said. "I was just thinking how people show who they are in the smallest moments." Richard's throat tightened. "Meaning?" Keanu smiled faintly. "You can tell how someone was raised by how they treat the people they think they don't need." The words landed softly, but struck deep. Someone at the bar muttered, "Well said." Richard tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He forced a stiff smile, murmured something about checking on his entree, and walked away quickly, his face pale beneath the warm light. Behind him, Keanu picked up his fork once more and resumed eating calm, quiet, and unbothered. Every eye in the restaurant seemed to stay on him, not because of his appearance, but because of the way he carried himself, as if he didn't need the room's approval to have dignity. And though no one yet knew his name, everyone could sense the truth lingering like a whisper. Whoever that man was, he wasn't ordinary. The tension in Aurelia had reached a quiet peak. Guests still ate and drank, but fewer conversations flowed now. The pianist's melody carried through the air like a thin thread trying to hold everything together. All eyes still found their way, in one way or another, toward the man in the corner, the one who never lost his composure. Mr. Henry Stanton sat at his table near the center of the dining room, his wife beside him, her hand lightly resting on his sleeve. He had watched enough to understand what was happening. There was no mistake left to be made. He had seen the rudeness, the deliberate humiliation, and the grace that answered it. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of disapproval and quiet resolve. "I can't just sit here," he murmured. His wife looked up at him gently. "Henry, maybe let the staff handle it." "The staff already failed," he said, rising slowly. "It's time someone remembered what respect looks like." The chatter softened as he made his way across the room. His cane clicked faintly against the floor, a sound that drew more eyes to him. Even Richard looked up from the bar, his smugness faltering when he saw the older gentleman approaching Keanu's table. Henry stopped just a few feet away. His posture was dignified, his gaze calm. "Son," he said warmly, "I've been coming here for 20 years. I've seen people thrown out for wearing the wrong tie, but I've never seen anyone handle disrespect with more grace than you just did." Keanu looked up, meeting the man's eyes with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm just here for dinner." Henry chuckled softly, the sound low and kind. "That's what makes it all the more admirable. Some men fight fire with fire. You fight it with calm." Their brief exchange drew soft murmurs from surrounding tables. The moment felt almost cinematic, the contrast between the man who had endured humiliation and the one who chose to acknowledge his dignity. But before the warmth could settle, Richard approached, his tone clipped. "Sir," he said firmly, addressing Henry, "I'd appreciate it if you'd return to your table. We try to keep the floor clear for staff." Henry turned slowly toward him, the friendliness in his face fading into steel. "You try to keep the floor clear, do you?" he said. "Is that what this is about? Keeping the room tidy while your manners unravel?" Richard blinked, caught off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "No," Henry said evenly. "You don't. If you did, you wouldn't speak to guests the way you have tonight." The whisper of voices spread again through the restaurant. Every word between them carried weight, echoing slightly in the still air. Keanu placed a hand on the table, his tone gentle but steady. "It's all right, sir. I appreciate what you said." But Henry shook his head. "No, son, it's not all right. Men like this learn to treat others this way because everyone else stays silent." Across the room, Lydia froze. So did Oliver. Even Marcel from the kitchen had stepped closer to the pass window, sensing something was unfolding that couldn't be ignored anymore. Richard's face tightened, but he tried to maintain composure. "Sir, please," he said sharply. "This is between me and the gentleman at this table. You don't need to involve yourself." Henry let out a soft laugh, not one of amusement, but disbelief. "Between you and him?" he repeated. "You mean your arrogance and his patience?" Several guests shifted in their seats. The comment struck like a bell, resonating across the marble floor. Even the pianist stopped mid-note, letting the silence speak louder than any melody could. Keanu rose slightly from his chair, his tone calm and steady. "Please, sir, you don't have to do this on my behalf." Henry shook his head, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not doing it for you, son. I'm doing it because I can't stomach seeing what this place has become." He turned back to Richard. "Do you even hear yourself when you speak? You think class comes from clothing or money. It doesn't. It comes from character, and right now, you're showing none." Richard's jaw clenched. He could feel the crowd's eyes pressing against him like heat. "I don't think you understand, sir. This restaurant has standards." "Standards?" Henry interrupted, his voice deep and measured. "Then start with the first one, respect." A ripple of approval moved through the room. Guests whispered to one another, some nodding subtly, others watching with quiet satisfaction, as the arrogance that had ruled the night began to crumble. Richard took a small step back, his tone defensive. "I'm only doing my job." Henry tilted his head slightly. "Your job isn't to humiliate paying guests. It's to make them feel welcome. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that." Lydia stood frozen near the bar, her throat tight. She had wanted to say those same words for months, but had never dared. Watching someone else say them out loud felt both terrifying and freeing. Richard's face was pale now. He looked toward the manager's office as though hoping for backup, but no one came. Oliver had stopped polishing glasses. Marcel was standing still in the kitchen doorway. Even the hostess pretended to rearrange menus just to avoid meeting his eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Keanu stood then, slow and deliberate. He placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly. "But really, it's fine." Henry studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you say so." He looked around the restaurant one last time, his voice lowering but still firm. "But some things shouldn't go unchallenged. Not in a place like this." As he returned to his table, a wave of murmurs followed him, admiring, grateful, and uneasy, all at once. Keanu sat down again, calm as ever, his expression thoughtful. Across the room, Richard tried to collect himself, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his notepad. For the first time that evening, he realized the truth that everyone else already knew. The man he had been mocking wasn't the one being diminished. He was the one being exposed. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen echoed faintly, followed by the sound of the swinging doors. Richard emerged once again, a polished tray in hand and a mask of composure stretched tight across his face. The main course, a beautifully plated fillet, served with roasted shallots and a drizzle of red wine reduction, was a masterpiece, though the arrogance with which it was delivered stripped it of grace. He carried it slowly, walking with the exaggerated precision of someone who wanted attention. The room, now half silent from the earlier confrontation, followed him with their eyes. Every step felt heavier, like the tension itself was weighing him down. He reached the corner table where Keanu sat, calm as ever, hands folded neatly in front of him. Richard paused, lifted the plate slightly higher, and with an insincere smile said, "Here's your meal, sir. I hope it's not too sophisticated." The word hung in the air like a blade. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Someone at a nearby table exhaled sharply, as if hoping to break the spell of discomfort. Lydia froze mid-step, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. Even the pianist, who had just begun another soft tune, faltered again and stopped playing altogether. Keanu looked up, his eyes steady, his tone gentle. "It looks perfect," he said simply. His calmness was disarming, and for a moment, Richard didn't know how to respond. But the quiet laughter of a few guests, disbelieving, sympathetic, made him feel cornered. He forced a chuckle, trying to reclaim dominance. "Perfect, is it?" he said, his voice carrying now. "Well, let's hope it matches your expectations. You sure you can afford the experience?" The moment froze. The question echoed across the dining room. It wasn't just rude, it was humiliating. The kind of insult meant to hurt, to draw blood.
Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't look embarrassed or angry. He simply set his napkin on the table, lifted his gaze, and met Richard's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and far stronger than the waiter's bluster. "The experience is free," he said quietly, but every word carried. "The lesson, however, might cost you more than you think." The entire restaurant fell silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Even Richard couldn't find a retort. His lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time all night, he wasn't in control. Not of his tone, not of the room, not even of himself. Keanu picked up his fork, cut into the steak, and took a bite. The small sound of the knife against porcelain echoed like thunder in the stillness. From her spot near the bar, Lydia's eyes welled up. It wasn't sadness, it was relief. Someone had finally said what the whole room had been thinking, and they had said it without cruelty. Richard turned slightly, aware of every eye now fixed on him. The smirk that had carried him through the night was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger, it was fear. The kind that comes when the truth finally finds its voice. For a moment, time seemed to stop inside Aurelia. The chandeliers flickered slightly from the movement of the air conditioning, their light reflecting across faces frozen in disbelief. Even the hum of the city outside seemed to fade beneath the weight of silence that Keanu's words had left behind. Richard's face drained of color. He looked around helplessly, realizing the diners were no longer pretending to ignore the scene. Their attention was fixed on him, eyes filled not with curiosity, but judgment. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. The power he had so carelessly wielded all night had vanished, replaced by a humiliation he didn't yet know how to hide. Keanu continued eating quietly, unbothered by the attention. His calm presence made everything else seem loud. The faint scrape of Richard's shoes, the heavy breath he tried to steady, the whisper of linen as guests shifted in their seats. At a nearby table, Mr. Stanton leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Well said," he murmured, loud enough for others to hear. "That's a man who knows the difference between pride and dignity." Others nodded subtly. A woman whispered to her companion, "Did you hear that?" He didn't raise his voice once. Lydia stood behind the bar, hands pressed against her apron. She felt her chest tighten with emotion. All night, she'd watched quiet cruelty unfold, helpless to stop it. But in a few short words, Keanu had turned humiliation into a lesson, one that everyone in that room would remember. Richard tried to salvage what remained of his pride. "Sir," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "if you found my service unsatisfactory, Keanu interrupted gently, "I didn't say that. I think you've shown me something worth far more than a meal." The simplicity of his response cut deeper than any insult could have. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was teaching, and the entire room was the classroom. Richard's hands tightened around his notepad until the paper creased. He wanted to say something cruel, something to reassert control, but he couldn't. The look in Keanu's eyes wasn't confrontational, it was knowing. It stripped away every illusion of superiority he had built for himself. Marcel stepped quietly out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He scanned the room and immediately understood. His gaze landed on Richard, cold and disappointed. "Enough," he said quietly but firmly. "You've done enough damage tonight." Richard didn't respond. He just stared down at the table, realizing too late that his words, his attitude, and his pride had undone him. Keanu finally placed his fork down and sat back, his expression serene. "It's strange," he said softly, as though thinking aloud, "how a single moment can reveal who we truly are." No one dared to speak after that. Even the pianist, hands hovering above the keys, stayed still. The silence that filled Aurelia wasn't empty. It was reflective. Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something important. Something that went far beyond dinner. And Richard, standing alone beside the quiet table, felt the full weight of what those words meant. The murmur of whispers grew heavier by the second. Guests leaned toward one another, uncertain whether they had just witnessed the climax of a confrontation or the calm before something greater. The waitstaff hovered near the kitchen doors, exchanging uneasy glances. Richard stood stiff beside the table, still pale, still reeling from Keanu's quiet words that had shattered his arrogance. Then, from the far end of the restaurant, the sound of firm, confident footsteps cut through the tension. The manager of Aurelia, Mr. Larkin, emerged from his office, a man in his early 50s with silvering hair, sharp posture, and a presence that commanded attention. He wore a tailored suit that reflected both discipline and authority. But his face was calm, carrying the composure of someone used to handling crises. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his tone measured but alert. He scanned the room, instantly aware of the eyes that turned toward him, the weight of the silence pressing down. He could feel it, the unmistakable heaviness of embarrassment hanging over his establishment. As he moved forward, his gaze followed the subtle cues of the guest's eyes until they led him to the far corner. There, he saw the man everyone was watching. For a brief moment, Larkin froze, his eyebrows lifted slightly, recognition flashing across his features. Then, in a tone filled with both shock and respect, he said, "Mr. Reeves?" The name rippled through the restaurant like a sudden breeze. Guests gasped softly, heads turning. Conversations halted entirely. Keanu looked up from his table, his calm smile unchanged. "Good evening," he said simply. Larkin blinked, his composure faltering for the first time. I wasn't told you'd be here tonight." His voice carried disbelief. "Sir, had I known, you wouldn't have let me wait an hour for dinner." Keanu asked gently, not accusingly. The question was soft, but it landed like thunder. Larkin's expression tightened with shame. "Mr. Reeves, my sincerest apologies," he said immediately, bowing slightly, a gesture that seemed almost out of place in the glittering dining room. "This should never have happened. Please, allow me to correct this immediately." Across the room, Richard stood frozen, color draining completely from his face. His lips parted, but he couldn't speak. Lydia, standing behind the bar, covered her mouth, her heart pounding in disbelief. Larkin turned toward him slowly, realization dawning. His voice hardened. "Richard," he said sharply, "is this your table?" Richard swallowed, his voice barely audible. "Yes, sir." Larkin's tone lowered, cold and precise. "Then you have a great deal to explain." The room was utterly silent now. Even the pianist had stopped pretending to play. Keanu, still seated, raised a hand calmly. "There's no need to make a scene," he said quietly. "Let's just talk." The restraint in his voice made the apology that followed feel heavier. Larkin nodded quickly, his respect evident. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. However you wish." He gestured toward an open space near the center of the room, his movements deferential. The staff and guests alike could sense what was coming the moment the entire night had been leading toward. Mr. Larkin moved closer to the table, his polished shoes whispering against the marble floor. The quietness of the restaurant made every step sound louder than it should have. The guests, still frozen in their seats, watched him with a mix of curiosity and unease. No one had ever seen the manager look so unsettled. He stopped beside Keanu's table, taking in the scene, the untouched wine, the impeccable dish, the pale waiter beside it. "Mr. Reeves," he said again, this time softer. "Please, accept my deepest apologies for what's happened tonight. If I'd known you were here, this would never have occurred." Keanu looked up, the faintest smile touching his lips. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said quietly. "It shouldn't depend on who someone is." The words sank into the room like stones dropped into still water. Even Larkin, a man long accustomed to delicate diplomacy, had no ready answer. He lowered his head slightly. "You're right, sir," he said. "Entirely right." Richard's throat tightened. He could feel every gaze cutting into him like glass. The name had changed everything, Mr. Reeves. Suddenly, the man he had mocked wasn't just another guest. He was a name known across the world, a man who commanded quiet respect wherever he went. And Richard, in his arrogance, had humiliated him in front of a crowd. Larkin turned sharply toward him. "You'll report to my office after service," he said. His tone was clipped and formal.
We will discuss your employment status then. Richard swallowed hard. Sir, No, Larkin interrupted, his voice low but firm. Not another word. Keanu raised a hand gently. Please, he said. There's no need to humiliate him further. Mistakes happen. What matters is what we learn from them. The grace in his voice silenced even the whispers. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defensive. He was calm, deliberate, and somehow commanding without trying to be. Larkin nodded slowly. Understood, Mr. Reeves. He hesitated. Would you like to move to a different table? Perhaps one with a better view? Keanu shook his head. No, this table's fine. I've already learned more here tonight than I could have from any view. For a moment, even Larkin's professional mask cracked, revealing genuine admiration. You honor this place by saying that, he said quietly. Keanu smiled faintly. Then let's honor it by making sure no one else has to earn respect the hard way. Those words lingered in the air long after he spoke them. Guests exchanged glances, humbled. Lydia turned slightly away, wiping at the corner of her eye. Even Oliver stood a little taller behind the bar, proud of what he had just witnessed. Larkin inclined his head once more, his tone respectful. As you wish, sir. Thank you for your patience. As he turned to leave, the silence in Aurelia broke at last, not with applause or cheers, but with a quiet clinking of glasses as people returned to their meals, a little more thoughtful, a little more aware. And Richard, standing alone beside the corner table, felt the weight of every choice he had made. The silence inside Aurelia was so deep it almost had a pulse. Every guest, every server, even the pianist who sat motionless at his instrument, waited to see what would happen next. The chandeliers cast soft light over the polished marble floors, illuminating faces filled with disbelief and shame. Richard stood beside the table like a statue, hands trembling at his sides, his face pale and hollow. Mr. Larkin turned toward him slowly, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. His voice, though quiet, carried a sharp edge. Richard, he said, do you have any idea who this man is? Richard blinked rapidly, his throat dry. He stammered, his voice breaking under the weight of the question. A guest? Larkin shook his head slowly, his tone hardening. He's one of our owners. The words struck the room like thunder. A wave of gasps rippled through the restaurant. Several glasses clinked softly as startled hands twitched. A woman at the nearest table whispered, "Owner?" while her husband's jaw fell open in disbelief. Even Lydia, who had suspected something extraordinary all along, felt her breath catch in her throat. Keanu sat quietly, still calm, still gracious, but there was a new weight in his presence. He didn't need to confirm what had just been said, his silence spoke enough. Richard took a step back, his legs unsteady. "I what?" he breathed, his voice cracked like glass. That can't be." "It is," Larkin said, cutting him off firmly. "Mr. Reeves is not just a part owner of Aurelia. He helped design the principles this place was founded on. Respect, humility, hospitality. And tonight, you managed to forget every single one of them." The sting of those words left Richard visibly shaken. His mouth opened, but no sound followed. He looked down, unable to meet Keanu's eyes. Keanu finally spoke, his tone calm but unyielding. "You didn't know," he said softly. "But now that you do, what matters is how you treat people who don't own the place." His words weren't angry. They were worse for Richard. They were kind, honest, impossible to defend against. They pierced through the silence like thunder and stayed echoing long after. "Mr. Stanton, still seated nearby, murmured under his breath. That's a lesson every man in this room should remember. Across the dining hall, guests nodded quietly, humbled. The same waiter who had strutted with confidence now stood small and broken, his arrogance stripped away by the truth. Keanu's gaze was steady but gentle. "A restaurant like this," he said, "doesn't earn its reputation from chandeliers or fine dishes. It earns it through the way people are treated, especially those you think don't belong here." Richard's shoulders sagged.
His lips trembled as he whispered, "I didn't mean." Keanu raised a hand slightly. "You meant what you believed," he said. "And now you have the chance to believe better." The quiet strength in his tone left no room for pride. The words didn't humiliate, they invited reflection. And in that moment, Richard looked less like a man being punished, and more like one being taught. Mr. Larkin stood in stunned silence beside Keanu's table, the truth now hanging in the air like a bright, undeniable light. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen. No forks moved. No glasses clinked. Even the candle flames on each table seemed to burn steadier, as if holding their breath. Richard's face had gone almost white. His eyes darted from Keanu to Larkin to the shocked guests surrounding them. He looked like a man standing in the aftermath of his own collapse, unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "When I first invested in Aurelia," he said gently, "I wanted this place to feel like home to everyone who walked through the door. A space where kindness mattered more than status." He paused, glancing around the room. But somewhere along the way, that message got lost. Larkin bowed his head. "You're right, sir, and I take full responsibility. This isn't who we are or who we're supposed to be." Keanu shook his head. "It's not about blame, it's about awareness." He turned toward Richard again. "You had every opportunity to show grace tonight. Instead, you chose judgment. You saw what you wanted to see and forgot to look deeper." Richard's voice quivered. I didn't recognize you, sir." "That's the point," Keanu replied softly. "You shouldn't have to recognize someone to treat them with respect." A murmur of agreement rippled through the dining room. Guests exchanged, looks some ashamed, some reflective. Lydia's eyes glistened as she stood behind the bar, clutching a glass towel like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Keanu's voice carried no anger, only quiet conviction. "What makes a restaurant great isn't luxury, it's heart. The smile of a server, the care behind a meal, the way people feel when they leave." Larkin nodded slowly, the truth of those words sinking deep. "You've reminded us of what we lost, Mr. Reeves," he said. Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe you never lost it. Maybe it just needed to be remembered." Richard's eyes filled with shame. "I don't know what to say." Keanu looked at him gently. "Then start by listening. The people who walk in wearing ordinary clothes deserve the same warmth as the ones wearing designer suits. You never know whose story you're walking past." The silence that followed was heavy but cleansing. It wasn't the kind born of fear, it was the kind that comes after truth. Finally, Mr. Stanton rose slightly from his seat, raising his glass in quiet respect. "To dignity," he said, his voice steady. "And to the man who reminded us what it looks like." Soft clinking followed as other guests lifted their glasses. The tension that had ruled the room was gone now, replaced by something humbler, something human. And as Keanu offered a modest nod in return, Richard bowed his head, the lesson etched deeper than any reprimand could ever reach. The restaurant was still hushed, though the air felt less tense now, more reflective. Richard stood near Keanu's table, trembling slightly, his pride shattered under the weight of truth. His mind scrambled for words, for anything that might undo what had been done, but every thought sounded hollow before it reached his lips. The silence pressed down until he finally tried to speak. I only meant," he began weakly, his voice cracking. He looked out of place. The excuse died in the air the moment it left his mouth. He heard himself say it, and felt the ugliness of it echo back at him. It was no longer defense, it was confession. Mr. Larkin's tone cut through the stillness like a blade. "Out of place?" he repeated, his eyes sharp and steady. "In a place meant for hospitality?" The words hit harder than any raised voice could. They rang with disappointment, not rage. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The moral failure was clear. Across the room, soft murmurs of agreement rippled among the diners. Someone clapped quietly. Then another joined. And soon, a low wave of applause spread through the dining hall. It wasn't loud or mocking, it was affirming. The sound carried a message of solidarity, as if the crowd itself wanted to apologize for what had happened. Richard's head dropped, his shoulders sagging under the sound. All the confidence that had once animated him drained away. The mask of arrogance cracked completely, revealing what was beneath fear, shame, and regret. Keanu rose from his chair slowly, his calm presence commanding attention without force. The applause softened as he stood. Every head turned toward him, waiting. Even those who didn't recognize him personally now understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered. He looked around the room, his voice even and low. "This restaurant should never make anyone feel less than human," he said. "If it did tonight, that's my failure as an owner, and I intend to fix it." The words landed with quiet force. No one expected him to take responsibility. Yet there he was, accepting blame not to protect his image, but to restore the meaning of the place itself. He turned slightly toward Richard. "You saw someone who didn't fit your picture of success," he continued gently. "But what you missed was simple. Every person who walks through these doors brings a story you know nothing about." The sincerity in his tone stripped away the last of Richard's defenses. He couldn't look up. His breathing came shallow, uneven. He wanted to disappear. Keanu let the silence linger before he spoke again. "I don't believe in punishment," he said softly. "I believe in change. If you're willing to learn, then this moment can still mean something." The words weren't just for Richard, they were for everyone in that room. Guests, staff, management, all of them could feel it. This wasn't a reprimand. It was a reflection of what kindness looked like when it met cruelty and chose compassion anyway. Richard's chest rose and fell unevenly. His pride was gone, stripped bare in front of strangers. He looked around the dining room, unable to meet anyone's eyes, then finally turned to Keanu. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I judged you by what I saw, not by who you are. I thought appearance meant value. I see now how wrong that is." Keanu nodded gently, not to accept submission but acknowledgement. "Understanding that," he said, "is the beginning of something better. But remember, it's not about me. It's about everyone who's ever walked into a place like this and felt invisible." Lydia, standing by the bar, wiped at her eyes. She had seen countless people treated unfairly by the subtle hierarchy of wealth, but hearing it spoken so plainly felt like a crack in something long frozen. Oliver stood beside her, murmuring, "That's leadership. That's what it's supposed to look like." Mr. Larkin cleared his throat softly and faced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice measured, "tonight we've been reminded of what Aurelia was built upon. Not extravagance, but grace. And I can promise you after tonight, we will do better." Another round of gentle applause followed, this time stronger, more unified. Guests nodded, some smiling, others looking thoughtful. What had begun as humiliation was becoming transformation, right there in front of them. Keanu stepped forward slightly, his tone quiet but firm. "We live in a world obsessed with surfaces," he said. "But the truth is, character shows in how we treat those who can't offer us anything in return." He looked at Richard, then scanned the room. "I've been rich. I've been poor. None of it ever changed who I tried to be. Respect doesn't come from money. It comes from how you make people feel." The pianist, who had been still for so long, began to play again. This time the music was softer, slower, carrying a weight of humility that matched the moment. Keanu smiled faintly, glancing toward Lydia and Oliver. "Everyone here deserves to feel seen," he said. "Not just the guests, but the ones serving them too." Mr. Larkin nodded firmly. "We'll make sure of that." Then Keanu turned once more to Richard. "I don't expect you to be perfect," he said. "But from this moment on, let your respect lead, not your assumptions." Richard's eyes were glassy. "I will, sir," he whispered. "You have my word." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder briefly, a gesture not of superiority, but forgiveness. The room seemed to exhale all at once. It was the kind of moment that changed not just reputations, but hearts. And though the evening would eventually continue, no one in Aurelia would ever forget the night humility reclaimed its place above pride. Hours later, Aurelia was no longer glowing with laughter and conversation. The last of the guests had gone, the chandeliers were dimmed, and the only sound left was the soft hum of the city filtering through the tall windows. The dining room, once full of whispers and judgment, was quiet now, carrying the weight of what had happened. The staff gathered near the center of the room. Servers, bartenders, kitchen hands, and hostesses all stood in a loose circle, their faces a mix of fatigue and unease. Mr. Larkin stood near the bar, his arms crossed tightly. Richard lingered in the back, his once confident posture replaced by something smaller, humbled. Then, Keanu entered. He wasn't dressed like a celebrity or an owner now. He had changed into a plain black shirt and jeans, simple and unassuming. Yet the air shifted the moment he stepped into the room. Everyone straightened, not out of fear, but out of respect. He stopped near the center of the circle and looked around at them, his gaze kind but steady. "Thank you for staying," he began. His tone was calm, low, and sincere. "I know it's been a long night, but I wanted to speak to all of you together because tonight wasn't just about one mistake. It was about what we value here." No one moved. Even Richard looked up, his eyes heavy but attentive. Keanu continued, "We all make mistakes. Every single one of us. What matters is what we take from them. Tonight reminded me that even in a place built on excellence, it's easy to forget the simplest truth." He paused for a moment, letting the quiet stretch. "We must learn to see people, not their shoes, not their jackets, not the image we think they represent." The words carried through the still air, soft but powerful. Lydia glanced down, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She had spent years in restaurants, and no one had ever said it so plainly. Keanu turned his gaze toward Richard. "You forgot what service means," he said gently. "But forgetting isn't unforgivable if you're willing to remember again." Richard nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I am, sir. I really am." Keanu gave him a small nod in return. "Good. Because service isn't just about food or presentation. It's about presence, about treating every guest like they matter, no matter what they look like when they walk through that door." He looked around the room again, meeting the eyes of every staff member one by one. "We don't exist to impress people. We exist to make them feel welcome. That's what makes Aurelia special and what will keep it that way." The staff stood silent, but the energy had changed. There was a weight to his words that none of them would forget. Keanu moved toward one of the tables, resting his hand lightly on its polished surface. "I know some of you have worked here for years," he said softly. "You've seen all kinds of people walk through those doors, the powerful, the wealthy, the famous. But the true measure of this place isn't how we serve those people. It's how we serve the ones who walk in, quietly, without recognition, expecting nothing more than kindness." He paused, letting the thoughts settle. "Because kindness," he continued, "isn't selective. It's not a privilege you give. It's a responsibility you live." Lydia swallowed hard, blinking away tears. Oliver nodded subtly beside her. Even the kitchen staff, who rarely looked up during meetings, stood still, their attention completely fixed on him. Richard shifted his weight, his voice trembling as he finally spoke. "I lost sight of that," he admitted. "I thought this place's reputation was built on image, on luxury. I forgot that the reason people come back isn't because of the chandeliers or the menu." Keanu looked at him gently. "They come back because they feel seen," he said. "And tonight, someone didn't." Richard's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. To you. To everyone here." Keanu nodded, his tone calm but firm. "An apology means something when it leads to change. You've been given that chance, Richard. Don't waste it." Mr. Larkin stepped forward then, his expression solemn but thoughtful. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "I promise you this won't be forgotten. Not by me, not by anyone here. We'll make sure Aurelia becomes what it was always meant to be, a place of genuine welcome." Keanu offered him a small, grateful smile. That's all I ask. Not perfection, just awareness. He turned back to the staff. What happened tonight wasn't just a moment of disrespect, it was a mirror. It showed us who we can become if we stop seeing people as people. But it also showed something else. It showed that compassion can still shift an entire room. His words lingered in the silence that followed. Outside, the city lights reflected off the restaurant's windows, faintly shimmering like distant stars. Tomorrow, Keanu said finally, this place opens again. And when it does, let's make sure no one who walks in ever feels less than human. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Lydia began to clap softly, joined by Oliver, then by the rest of the staff until the sound filled the quiet restaurant. It wasn't applause for fame or status, it was gratitude. Keanu smiled faintly. Thank you, he said. Now go home, get some rest. Tomorrow, we start fresh. As the staff dispersed, Richard lingered behind. Keanu met his gaze one last time and said quietly, "You'll do better." Richard nodded, voice barely a whisper. "I will, sir." When Keanu finally stepped out into the night, the air was cool and still. Behind him, the lights of Aurelia dimmed, but inside, something had been reignited. A quiet promise to lead with dignity and to serve with heart. The restaurant lights were dim now, casting soft gold across the tables. Most of the staff had gathered near the entrance, waiting to say good night, but Keanu lingered near the center of the room. The night had left its mark on everyone. No one spoke, yet a quiet current of understanding pulsed through the silence. Richard stood apart from the others, his eyes red and weary. His crisp uniform, once worn with pride, now felt heavy, like a reminder of who he had been just hours ago. He looked at the floor, hands clasped tightly, until finally he found the courage to step forward. The sound of his shoes against the marble echoed softly in the vast room. "I need to say something," he began. His voice was unsteady, his throat tight with emotion. "To all of you." The staff turned toward him. No one interrupted, even Mr. Larkin folded his arms and watched quietly, waiting. Richard took a deep breath. "I judged him," he said, his tone trembling, but honest. "I judged everyone who didn't fit the picture I thought belonged here. I thought standards meant exclusion. I thought elegance was about who could afford to sit in these chairs. I was wrong." His words hung in the air, heavy but cleansing. He looked at Keanu then, eyes shining. "You showed me tonight that true class isn't about chandeliers or wine lists. It's about decency, about humility, about treating people like people." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "I've been chasing approval from the wrong places. I thought my job was to protect this restaurant's image, but the truth is, I've been protecting my own ego. I forgot what hospitality really means." No one moved. Even the faint hum of the city outside seemed to fade. Lydia wiped her eyes quietly at the bar. Oliver exhaled slowly, nodding to himself. Richard's next words came softer but steadier. "I'll do better, not because he's famous, but because he reminded me of decency, because he made me see what I lost." Keanu stepped forward then, his expression gentle but resolute. "That's where change begins," he said. "It's not about that punishment. It's about awareness. You can't undo the past, but you can choose what kind of person you'll be when you wake up tomorrow." Richard nodded slowly, emotion tightening his jaw. "Then that's what I'll do. Tomorrow, I start over." Keanu smiled faintly. "Good, because redemption isn't about perfection, it's about effort. The moment you stop learning is the moment you stop growing." For the first time that night, the tension in the room began to ease. The staff exchanged glances, some smiling softly, others nodding in quiet approval. The air felt lighter, calmer, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the lesson. Keanu took a step closer, resting a hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair. His tone stayed calm, but there was warmth behind every word.
"Richard," he said, "you faced yourself tonight. That's harder than facing anyone else. Most people run from that moment. You didn't." Richard lowered his head. "I wanted to," he admitted, "but the truth wouldn't let me. I saw what I became in the mirror of your patience." Keanu's faint smile carried no pride, only understanding. Patience isn't weakness, it's strength in disguise. Tonight, you learned what real service means, and so did everyone else here. He looked around the room. All of us live in a world that praises status over kindness. But here, we get to be different. We get to set a standard that doesn't depend on what's in someone's wallet, but what's in their heart. A soft murmur of agreement spread among the staff. Lydia's voice broke the quiet. "You reminded us why we started doing this in the first place," she said. "To make people feel valued. To give them something good to remember when they leave." Keanu nodded. "That's the essence of hospitality. It's not about luxury, it's about connection." Mr. Larkin, usually composed and distant, stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of sincerity. "I've managed restaurants my whole career," he said. "But tonight, I realized I've been managing systems, not people. That ends now." Keanu gave a small nod of gratitude. "That's leadership," he said. "When change starts from the top, it flows to everyone beneath it." Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll earn back your trust. Not through words, but through what I do next." Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You already started. The hardest part of growth is admitting where you went wrong. The rest is consistency. Keep showing up with humility. That's how trust rebuilds itself." For a long moment, no one spoke. The golden light of the chandeliers flickered softly across their faces, reflecting the quiet unity that had replaced pride and division. Keanu took one last look around the room. "This place," he said slowly, "feels different now. It feels alive again. More human than luxurious. That's what I always wanted Aurelia to be. A place where people come not just to eat, but to feel something real." The staff responded with gentle applause. Not the loud kind meant to celebrate, but the soft, grateful kind that carries meaning. Every clap echoed with shared respect. Keanu smiled, then looked at Richard one final time. "Remember this night," he said, "not as the worst shift of your life, but as the one that changed everything." Richard nodded firmly. "I will, sir." As the applause faded, the staff began to drift toward the door, their steps lighter than when the night began. Keanu lingered a moment longer, watching them leave, his expression reflective. Outside, dawn was breaking. The first pale light of morning spilled through the windows, touching the floor with quiet promise. And for the first time in years, Aurelia didn't just shine, it felt whole. Morning sunlight poured through the wide glass windows of Aurelia, painting the empty tables in soft gold. The echoes of the previous night still lingered in the air, but something about the place felt lighter, now warmer. The weight of judgment that had once filled its walls had been replaced by the quiet dignity of change. Outside, newspapers sat stacked neatly at the cafe across the street, their front pages catching the attention of early commuters. In bold black letters, one headline stood out: "Actor Keanu Reeves teaches humility in his own restaurant." The article beneath it told the story in detail: the quiet confrontation, the lesson in grace, the simple truth that had resonated far beyond those marble walls. But what captured the most attention was a single line quoted from Keanu's closing words that night: "Kindness is the true luxury." By midday, that quote had already begun to trend across social media. Thousands of posts shared the message, accompanied by a photo someone had taken discreetly, a shot of Keanu standing in the middle of Aurelia, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed, as the staff applauded around him. The image carried the stillness of humility and the strength of authenticity. Inside the restaurant, the morning staff prepared for the day's service. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. Lydia moved with quiet focus behind the counter, setting down clean cups and straightening silver trays. The atmosphere was different now, more genuine, less mechanical.
Conversations carried an undertone of meaning. Richard stood near the entrance, dressed in his uniform again, though this time without the stiffness of ego. His posture was relaxed, his smile real. After his suspension and retraining, Keanu had personally asked him to return under one condition: that he lead by example, not by appearance. As guests began to arrive, Richard greeted them with sincerity that surprised even himself. "Good morning," he said to an elderly couple entering the room. "Welcome back to Aurelia. It's good to see you." His tone carried warmth instead of rehearsed charm. The couple smiled, recognizing him from the viral article. "We saw what happened," the woman said kindly. "You've got a fine teacher." Richard's eyes softened. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "The best one I've ever had." "Nearby, mister," Larkin observed quietly, hands in his pockets, pride glimmering in his expression. What had begun as humiliation had transformed into a rebirth not just for one man, but for the restaurant as a whole. The walls of Aurelia finally reflected its true purpose. At one of the corner tables, sunlight catching the rim of his coffee cup, sat Keanu. He looked calm, at peace, as if watching the morning unfold was enough. But when the door opened again, his attention lifted. The older gentleman from the night before stepped inside, dressed in a light gray coat, carrying a newspaper under his arm, and a knowing smile. The older gentleman spotted Keanu immediately and made his way over with slow, measured steps. His silver hair glowed in the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. He carried the same quiet dignity he had shown the night before, though now it was paired with something lighter, a smile of recognition. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Keanu gestured to the seat across from him. "Please," he said softly. "It's good to see you again." The man placed his newspaper on the table, folded neatly. The headline faced upward, bearing the same words that had spread across the city that morning. He tapped it once with his finger and said, "Seems the world took notice of what happened last night." Keanu looked at the photo, then back to the man. "I didn't plan for any of that," he said. "It just happened." The man chuckled quietly. "The best lessons usually do." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence as a server approached, with 2 cups of coffee. It was Richard who brought them, his hands steady, his demeanor humble but composed. He set the cups down gently, making sure not to interrupt. "Here you go, gentlemen," he said with a warm smile. "Cream or sugar?" Keanu smiled back. "Black is fine." "Thank you, Richard." The older man nodded approvingly as Richard walked away. "He's changed," he said. Keanu took a sip of his coffee, savoring the quiet. "He remembered," he replied. "Sometimes people need to forget who they think they are before they can see who they're meant to be." The man leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "You kept your calm through all that," he said. "Most men in your position would have walked out or fought back." Keanu's gaze drifted toward the window where the sunlight reflected softly on the glass. "Some lessons," he said quietly, "need silence. Anger only makes noise. Silence leaves room for reflection." The man smiled. "That's wisdom, hard-earned." Keanu shrugged lightly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just survival. You learn a lot by listening, especially to the people who underestimate you." They both laughed softly, sharing a moment that felt unspoken yet complete. Around them, Aurelia had come alive again. Guests chatted over breakfast. The pianist, back in his corner, played a gentle melody that drifted through the air like morning light. The tension that had once clouded the room had been replaced with warmth, laughter, and grace. Richard moved from table to table, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. He carried himself differently now, less like a man performing and more like one connecting. Every good morning he offered felt sincere, every smile earned, not rehearsed. As Keanu watched him, the older gentleman followed his gaze. "You did something good here," he said. Keanu shook his head softly. "No," he replied. "We did. Everyone who decided to look inward last night helped change this place." The man smiled again, raising his coffee cup. "Then, here's to kindness, the rarest luxury left in this world." Keanu lifted his cup in return. "To kindness," he echoed. Their cups clinked gently, the sound small but full of meaning. Outside, the city moved on with its day, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place within these walls. And as Keanu sat back, watching the life return to Aurelia, he realized the restaurant didn't need grand gestures to feel extraordinary anymore. It had found something better heart. The morning air was cool and calm as Keanu stepped out of Aurelia. The California sunrise painted the horizon in soft orange and pink, stretching long rays of light over the quiet street. Behind him, the restaurant glowed with a warmth that wasn't just from its polished chandeliers, but from the transformation that had taken place inside. It was no longer a monument to status. It had become a symbol of humility, forgiveness, and second chances. Keanu paused on the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the worn leather jacket that had sparked so much judgment the night before. The same jacket, the same man, but now, the meaning felt different. The reflection in the window showed more than his face. It showed a story that had reached countless others who saw themselves in that quiet exchange between pride and grace. For a few moments, he stood still, listening to the faint city sounds blending with the morning breeze. A young delivery boy passed on his bicycle, humming to himself. Across the street, a woman walking her dog smiled faintly as she recognized him but chose not to interrupt. Keanu returned the smile, nodding politely before turning his gaze back toward the restaurant doors. Inside, Richard was speaking with the new morning staff, his tone gentle, his words deliberate. Through the glass, Keanu could see him holding open the door for a guest, something that once might have seemed beneath him. Now it looked natural, an instinct born of understanding rather than duty. That single gesture confirmed to Keanu that what had happened inside Aurelia would last far beyond the headlines. He began walking slowly down the quiet boulevard, sunlight glinting off the windows of nearby shops. The scent of roasted coffee drifted from the cafe on the corner, mingling with the soft rhythm of the city waking up. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt something rare contentment, not born of success, but of meaning. He thought about how easy it was for the world to confuse luxury with value, to measure people by what they wear instead of what they are. But the truth, he thought, is that real worth doesn't shine. It radiates quietly, through kindness, through grace. As he turned a corner, he whispered to himself, "Respect shouldn't depend on who's watching. It should depend on who we are." The words echoed softly in the air, carried by the wind, as if the city itself wanted to remember them. Keanu continued walking until he reached the end of the block. The wind brushed lightly against his face, carrying the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. He stopped for a moment and looked back at Aurelia. Through the wide front windows, he could see people beginning to gather for brunch, families, workers, tourists, none of them knowing the story that had unfolded there just hours earlier. Yet somehow, the atmosphere already felt different. The laughter was real. The smiles looked unforced. He thought about the strange duality of fame, that people see your face everywhere, yet few see who you really are. But last night wasn't about him being recognized. It was about what happened when someone forgot to see another human being at all. That was what had hurt the most, not the insult itself, but how normal such behavior had become. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The light grew stronger now, spilling across the street like a promise. He could still hear the echo of Richard's voice from the night before, broken, sincere, redeemed. He had seen pride crumble into humility, and from that, something honest had bloomed. Keanu glanced at a small cafe across the street, its patio filled with strangers reading newspapers, sipping coffee, scrolling through their phones. A few of them were reading the morning article about him. Some smiled, some looked thoughtful. One young waiter, carrying a tray of croissants, stopped to whisper something to his coworker. Keanu caught just a few words, "Kindness is the true luxury," before they both smiled and went back to work. That, more than any headline, made him smile, because it meant the message had reached where it needed to go, into ordinary hearts, not through outrage or spectacle, but through quiet truth. He continued walking toward the park at the end of the street. A row of jacaranda trees swayed gently, purple petals scattered like confetti along the pavement. A small group of street musicians was setting up nearby. Their laughter echoed softly as one of them began tuning a guitar. Keanu stopped to listen for a moment. The sound of the strings blended with the hum of the city, reminding him of something timeless. Life always moves forward, but lessons stay. He took a final look toward the restaurant, the sunlight glinting off its glass door. His voice in his mind was calm, reflective, and full of quiet conviction. Respect shouldn't depend on who's watching, he thought. It should depend on who we are. He walked on, disappearing into the gentle brightness of the California morning, leaving behind not a story of scandal or celebrity, but of decency restored. And now, to everyone listening, one question lingers. Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked, dressed, or spoke? If you have, you know how heavy that moment feels and how powerful kindness can be when it breaks through. So, tell us your story in the comments below. Share the moment someone surprised you with compassion, or when you chose to see beyond appearances. And let us know what kind of kindness you'd like Keanu to teach next. Because in a world full of noise and judgment, every story of humility reminds us of what truly matters: the quiet strength of respect and the simple truth that dignity belongs to everyone.